All right, folks, we're going to get a little bit deeper into variables right now. And we've already learned some stuff, but we're going to go a little bit deeper. Let's do it. So some objectives for today, we're going to learn how to declare and use a decimal variable. It's another type of variable. And while we're at it, since we're using decimals and numbers, we're going to learn about some basic mathematical operations, real easy, basic math stuff. All right, so here's the plan. We'll start by talking about variables and variable types, just to review from the previous lecture. We'll talk specifically about decimal variables, that's another variable type, and we'll do math operations. All right, so let's talk about variables and variable types again. So remember what a variable is for, right? It's so we can hang on to a number and use it later and store it somewhere in the computer. So for example, if we said my variable is equal to 12, that means we've made a little box and we're sticking the number 12 in there. Okay, and it's just a little storage space for a piece of data so that if we run the computer and do a whole bunch of other stuff, we can always come back and take that 12 out of my variable and stick it somewhere else, like in a text box. No problem. All right, remember, of course, before we use variables, we have to declare them, and we use that dim statement to do just that. And to use the dim statement, we say dim, and then we give the variable a name, and then we give it a variable type. Now, that's really important. There are lots of different types of variables, and today we're going to learn a new one. All right, so that's all review. Let's talk a little bit more about the types of variables. We're going to learn a new one today called decimal variables. All right, so we have one type of variable which is called a string, right? And a string is when we use text. Some examples of strings are hello world or PHA wizards. You'll notice I put those in quotation marks. That's text, right, for a string. An integer, on the other hand, is the other variable type that we've learned so far, is for storing numbers, but it's specifically for whole numbers, right? Not 4.2, but just 4. So these are examples of integers. It's 142 and negative 345. These are whole numbers, and so those are integers. Those are the two types for variables that we've had so far, but today I'm going to introduce you to a new one, and it's called a decimal. Okay, so a decimal is just another type of variable. The difference is a decimal is for storing decimals, is for storing numbers that are not whole. So 1.4353 or negative 54.244. These are good examples of stuff to be put in a decimal variable type. Okay, and a decimal can have up to 28 decimal places, so I think that would be fine for most of our use. We don't really need to worry about the size of it. So I want to show you how this works. We're going to jump into a little bit of code. So I'm going to go over to Visual Basic. And here's what we're going to do. I'm going to put a single text box on the form, and I'm going to also put a single button. All right. And when I double click on the button, it brings up the code for that button. Okay. And normally, guys, I want to change the names of stuff. I don't want this to be button 1, right? And I don't want it to be text box 1. But for now, I'm just going to roll with it because I'm just making this program quickly. All right. So let's say I was to dim a variable, and I'll call it my number as an integer, right? This is an old statement that we've been using for another project now. And basically what that does is it makes a little box, it makes a little space in the computer where I can put my number later on, okay? And it's saving enough space for an integer, and it's treating those numbers like integers. So if I say my number is equal to, say, 5, okay, that's just fine. I'm putting the number 5 inside the my number variable. And then I can say, all right, text box 1 dot text is equal to my number. And that will take the my number variable and whatever content is in there, it will put it in the text box. So that if I run the program and I click button 1, I should see 5 in the text box because I said in the code that I'm going to make a little space, call it my number. I'm going to put the number 5 in there, and then I'm going to put whatever's in that box, which is the number 5, into the text box. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. That's all review. Now let's talk about what would happen if instead of 5 here, we used 5.6. Okay, I've still got my number declared as an integer. Okay, that's why it is right here. You can see it's declared as an integer. So if I put 5.6 in there, let's see what happens. So again, I'll run the program. And if I hit the button, okay, so the number 6 came up in the text box instead of 5.6. And that's because I've declared my variable as an integer. And an integer can only be whole numbers. So 5.6 is rounded to the nearest whole number, 6, when it's placed inside my number. Okay. However, if I change this from an integer to a decimal, and then I run my program, this time, because I've chosen decimal as the type instead of integer, the 5.6 remains a decimal number, 5.6. So hopefully that makes sense. The idea is it depends on how you declare your variables, how they will behave. If you declare a variable as a decimal, then it can be displayed as a decimal. If you declare it as an integer, it will be rounded to the nearest integer. And so that's why a decimal is useful. Sometimes we need numbers like that. If we're working with dollars, for example, and cents, we need to have something between 1 and 2, not just 1 and 2. Let's say if something costs $1.50, we need something that's 1.5. Okay, so that's the point of a decimal thing, and that's going to be pretty important as we move along. All right, so that's it for decimals. That's just another variable type, and you just go through your life the same way we did before, but now instead of just strings and integers, we also have decimals that we can declare using that dim statement.